Double, dribble, toil, and tribble? It's NES Works episode 57. The sports games we've seen so far on NES have been, let's just say, somewhat less than inspiring. The bulk of them have been Nintendo's black box games, whose rudimentary nature is given away by the fact that Nintendo named them after the sports they represent. Nothing fancier, no real creative ambition, just nuts and bolts sports adaptations. And, fair enough, the early days of the American NES and the Japanese Famicom were proving grounds of sorts. A critical time for Nintendo and its licensees, not only to set them apart from what had come before, but also to lay down the basics of what the platform was capable of. Sports adaptations were a great way to accomplish that. Because they're video games, based on real-world rules and events, they create a common reference point to allow players to get a sense of how a system works. But in late 1987, as the NES approached its 2-year anniversary in America, and Hudson prepared to launch the first real challenger to the Famicom in the form of Japan's PC Engine, Nintendo and friends needed to up their game. The likes of baseball and soccer would no longer work. No, the market called for more dynamic, digital renditions of sports. Games that would stand out for their features, their visuals, or some other intangible something. Or a tangible something in the case of stadium events, which made use of an exercise mat peripheral to add an element of physicality to its competitive sports games design. Bandai didn't invent this concept, of course, as gimmicky peripherals had been with the gaming ever since the early days of the home console. It definitely experienced a boom during the thick of the Famicom era, though, as publishers struggled to stand out in a rapidly expanding market dense with competition. Consider our friends at Konami, who took a similar route to Bandai with their Famicom boxing title, Exciting Boxing, which belonged to the company's Exciting line of arcade sports titles. Exciting Boxing was a decent enough sports sim, but it came with an absolutely bonkers peripheral, an inflatable speedback controller printed with a cartoon effigy of another boxer. In other words, publishers went to great lengths to stand out on Famicom and NES. It wasn't always quite so zany as Exciting Boxing, though. Consider Konami's Exciting Basketball arcade port for Famicom Disk System. Exciting Basketball didn't come with any kind of weirdo peripheral, but it made a lasting impression on players all the same. This was especially true of its NES conversion, the only exciting sports title released for NES, which shipped in September 1987 under the name Double Dribble. Double Dribble stood out for its quality. It's a fast-paced, 5-on-5 professional basketball simulation, loaded with all the grace notes you'd expect from the company that brought us Gradius and Castlevania. The players here have that distinct Konami house style, realistic proportions, blank faces, and limited animation cycles that somehow come off as fluid. The team members here look for all the world as though the heroes of Russian Attack or Castlevania had slipped on some colorful jerseys and decided to shoot three-pointers instead of communists or Draculas. Sound-wise too, Double Dribble upholds Konami's reputation for excellence. The game opens with a literal statement of intent as a sample voice proclaims before slipping into a solid rendition of the US national anthem. The in-game sound effects are great too. The laid-back game selection screen theme is one of the few musical melodies present during gameplay, but the silence of the game sessions leaves the soundstage open for perfect sound effects. The squeak of shoes on the court, the bounding of the ball, the urgency of on-the-spot rallying themes, and above all, the explosive burst of a great throw, using the same sound effects that would show up the following year in Life Force and Contra. But what really made Double Dribble stand out were the slam dunks. Getting close and sink a basket and Double Dribble would reward you with a stunning full-screen splash graphic in which your larger-than-life player would perform a slow-motion layup. Not every close-range attempt would result in one of these flashy showcase animations, and that only served to make them all the more remarkable. At the time of Double Dribble's launch, these were the most incredible thing that had ever been seen in an NES game. Sure, palette limitations meant the animated players were depicted in grayscale against a colorized background, and yes, the crowds in the stands were rendered as random stochastic dots. But it didn't matter. With Double Dribble, NES graphics went from modest abstractions to massive, almost photorealistic animations that put even Castlevania's impressive ending sequence to shame. It also introduced NES players to a concept that would take off on the console in about a year and a half, the cutscene. Ninja Gaiden is still a good 50 episodes away, so the idea of cinematic rewards in a video game were more or less exclusive at this point to dated Laserdisc arcade games and flashy Cinemaware titles for personal computers. Perhaps not coincidentally, Konami's Ultra label would convert Cinemaware's Defender of the Crown to NES in 1989. That said, unlike many other showy cinematic games of the era, Double Dribble had more going for it than just Flash. It presented players with a sports simulation that managed to toe the line between streamlined and substantial. Its 5-on-5 format never gets bogged down with too many team-oriented options, yet critical functions like passing, driving, and shooting feel both intuitive and cohesive. It's not the deepest basketball game in the world, but compared to previous team sports games for NES, think 10-yard fight, soccer, volleyball, it makes for a vastly more enjoyable experience. It also does a nice job of skirting up to the edge of familiar licensed sports brands without actually committing any legal fouls. Double Dribble includes 4 different teams, one of which is only playable in 2-player mode, and while none of them are precisely identical to contemporary sports teams of the 80s kids got the idea. There are the CPU-only Boston Frogs, who are clearly the Celtics. As is fitting for a game published alongside the Larry Bird-era Celtics, this team amounts to the boss, with great stats and skills. This is actually something Double Dribble on NES does differently from its arcade counterpart. The arcade game lacked any real differentiation between teams, but the NES game unbalances the teams to create a little more variety and challenge. You also have the New York Turkeys, the Chicago Devils, and the Los Angeles Hot Dogs. These names do not make a lot of sense or map reasonably onto their real-world counterparts, but Konami picked the cities that hosted the hottest teams of the era, and it did the trick. There's not a huge amount of strategy to the game. You dribble, pass, shoot, steal, block, the usual. You can swap between defenders by pressing B, slam dunk by holding B, foul opposing players and give them free throws, and so on. Key strategies tend to revolve around stealing, avoiding dead zones for shooting, and making as many three-pointers as possible. It's not the greatest take on basketball ever, though honestly there wasn't much competition on NES compared to, say, baseball or wrestling. The fact that this was a good take on the sport, and it was full of Konami grace notes, well, that basically cemented it a place in video game history. For a game less secure in its legacy, we have Ring King, the very first boxing game for NES, by a matter of weeks. Unfortunately, those few weeks weren't enough to help this game get ahead of the absolute video game Goliath that was about to hit the US, and utterly overshadow Data East's not quite competent boxing title. These days, Ring King is mostly known for not being Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, and a weird sprite art choice that creates the impression that your boxer receives oral sex from his trainer between rounds. But hey, at least someone's having a good time here. Ring King comes to us from Data East, and as with previous Data East titles, it's a port of an arcade game. And as with previous Data East titles, it's also not that enjoyable to play. Pugilism in Ring King amounts to maneuvering around the ring, trying to land blows on an opponent while avoiding counterpunches. It's a pretty miserable single-player experience, as one might expect from a sports game of this vintage. As usual, CPU-controlled opponents quickly expand in difficulty and quickly venture into the realm of unfairness, with an uncanny knack for delivering technical knockouts that seems to be considerably more difficult for human players to earn. About the most notable innovation you'll find here are the end-of-round passwords to allow you to continue your progress in the current circuit, a first for an NES sports game. Otherwise, it's just the same brain-dead action with the same palette swap sprites over and over again. Unlike with the other Data East arcade conversions we've seen on NES to date, Ring King's home port does not appear to have been developed by SAS Sakata. It's kind of hard to pin down exactly who did what here, as credits for the different versions are muddied across different online resources. The Game Developer Research Institute suggests the arcade version was programmed by Jaztec, with creative duties handled by a studio called Nue Design. The arcade version appears to have been manufactured and distributed by Data East in America and by a little-known company called Woodplace Inc. in the UK. In Japan, however, the arcade version seems not to have been available at all, while the Famicom version was issued by Namco under the name Family Boxing to go along with games like Family Stadium and Family Jockey, and then Data East brought it to NES. These online resources don't offer any indication of which developer actually programmed the NES adaptation, but maybe that's by design. I can't imagine anyone would necessarily want this lukewarm mess of a game on their resume. Well, the good news is that you don't have to wait too long for a palate cleanser. Mike Tyson's just around the corner, and he's going to take a big old bite out of this game's reputation, so to speak. Next time on NES Works, a real son of a gun. Peter gun, that is.